This is the Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today we're talking about negotiations. Welcome, business buyers. What is our goal with this video, negotiations? It's to get prepared to successfully negotiate a deal with the seller. We're going to identify common issues and then suggest viable solutions. Preparation is the key. Let's dive right in. Number one, you need a negotiation strategy. The seller is not likely to accept your initial offer. The seller expects some back and forth. There's going to be some back and forth. So you need a plan or strategy to help guide you through that process. Number two is understanding who has the leverage, the buyer or the seller. Who has the stronger negotiating position? Let's take a look at a couple of deals and some examples. In deal one, we have a seller where it's a new listing, brand new. It's a growing and profitable business. There are already multiple bidders at the table. The business has a recurring revenue model. Things are looking good. The buyer, on the other hand, unknown, cold inquiry. Seller has no connection to the buyer. Buyer can only make a small or negligible closing payment. Buyer has no industry experience and no proof of funds. And if we take a look at them side by side, I think it's easy to conclude that in this case, the seller has the better negotiating position. And of course, that can vary in strength. Sometimes sellers completely dominate buyers when it comes to negotiating leverage. But that's not always the case. Let's take a look at deal two. This time, we've got a seller whose business has been on the market longer than 12 months. The business is on autopilot. It's just bumping along. They've received no offers in months. The seller is motivated and distressed. On the other hand, the buyer has a known profile, a known quantity, is going to make a 90% closing payment based upon it being an SBA deal, good industry experience, and a successful track record in buying small and medium businesses. If we take a look at them side by side, I think we'd conclude that this time the buyer has the negotiating leverage. And of course, it can vary in strength as well. So when it comes to understanding who has the leverage and who is in the stronger position, it's important because you don't want to overplay or underplay your hand. You want to know where you stand. Number three, establish a firm negotiation range. And that starts with the valuation range. Whenever we value a business, there's typically a high-low range. We go from the low end to the high end. We also want to factor in the ask price that the seller is asking for the business. Very often it is higher than the high end of the valuation range that you come up with. When it does happen, I have some immediate questions on that. I guess primarily I'm wondering, is this the seller just posturing? Is this seller wishful thinking? Or does the seller have a firm conviction that their business is really worth that much? That's a really important question for you to try and take your best shot at answering. So if we're going to establish our negotiation range, we have an initial offer, and at some point, we're going to hit walk away. We're not going to go any higher. Now, exactly where that walk away is, kind of differs deal to deal. It might be substantially below the high end of the valuation range. It might exceed it in some cases, right? We won't necessarily meet the seller's ask price, but we'll get halfway there. Regardless of where the walk away is, the dollar value of the walk away price is less important. Having a walk away price is more important. And that walkaway price should be determined through objective reasoning and analysis, not personal emotion. Decisions based on emotion, that's what leads to deal fever. And so the number one cause of buyer's remorse in the dozens and dozens of people that I've worked with who have bought a business is deal fever. And deal fever happens when emotions dominate reasoning and analysis, and we definitely want to avoid that. Number four, we want to rank order the seller's most important priorities. What motivates the seller the most? Come up with your own list. Here's one that I sometimes use. Total selling price, protecting the legacy of the business, getting the money up front, the treatment of employees, the success of the business, and the seller's continued involvement. Those are all 6 motivating factors that I've witnessed in past deals. Sometimes I'll use a list that has more or less, but let's just use this one for our example. Deal number 1. We're trying to figure out what motivates the seller most. And by far, the most motivating factor for this seller is the selling price. This is a price-driven seller. They're looking for top dollar, and they want as much of the money as possible up front. The rest of it, protecting legacy, treatment of employees, success of the business, continued involvement, just doesn't do much for them. Now, do those kinds of sellers exist? Sure, of course they do. If you ask me to profile this kind of seller, to me, it looks like somebody who's the second or third or fourth owner of the business, maybe owned it less than 5 years, bought it in the first place for almost completely financial reasons. They've improved the business a little bit. They've held it. Now they want to sell it and they want to see a return. It's all about the money for that particular seller. Well, that's going to impact our negotiation strategy. Deal number 2, totally different seller. In this case, protecting legacy is most important. Treatment of employees is next. The seller does want some continued involvement in the business, and the seller really wants the business to continue being successful in the future. In terms of selling price and the money up front, less important. Sellers kind of set up financially for life. They're not financially motivated. That's all taken care of. They're not going to give their business away, but it's not the driving, motivating factor. Could I profile this particular seller? Yeah, this looks like a second or third generation seller, a family business. Someone whose family's name is on the business, maybe been around for decades, long-time employees that need to be treated well. They really want to see the business to continue to operate under the same name, in the same location. Legacy is important. That, of course, is also going to impact our negotiation strategy. So what motivates the seller most? I boil it down to this. You can't effectively trade concessions without knowing what the seller values the most. So we want to try and figure that out. Number 5, I would say it's best to negotiate deal points as part of a package. What I'm getting at is we want to try to avoid finalizing deal points one by one. You see it happen a lot. A seller and a buyer go at it. The seller's adamant. The buyer's very reluctant on a specific deal point, but eventually makes a bigger concession than they want to in the interest of trying to move this thing along and get things closed. But the next one, it's rinse and repeat. What's the antidote for that? Try and get all the deal points on the table at the same time. Of course, we'll have to go through them individually, but as part of the whole package. And so that way we can trade concessions as part of that package. I think we're in a much stronger position to do that. And then when we finally do get agreement on the package, we're finally done and we don't necessarily need to worry about the seller coming back and trying to get more. 6, can we set a price anchor with our initial offer? You want to assess whether you can anchor the price range with an opening offer. That offer has to be reasonable. What does that mean? It means if we're going to have a negotiation around a number, we'd like to get our number out there as the anchor point to those negotiations. And that's what a price anchor is. So making an opening offer where there is no ask price, right, can work to anchor the price range. Of course, it's not foolproof, but it is one little tool we can have in our toolkit. Number 7, I like to use if-then statements to manage concessions. In other words, I want to avoid conceding without asking for something in return. I call this no freebies. If you will agree to blank, then we'll agree to blank. If the seller's looking for a concession, if we're willing to agree to it, we want to ask for something in return. We don't give concessions away. Number 8, be prepared to walk away to stop the nibbling. Sellers will never stop asking for concessions as long as you keep conceding. So we have to tell them no in some way. We have to walk away. We have to put a stop to it. I often tell them I can't concede. I prefer that over saying I won't concede. It might be a small difference, but I find it at least a little bit effective for me. However you do it, you have to stop the nibbling. Otherwise, they'll never stop asking for concessions. Number 9, if an offer is rejected, always ask for a counteroffer. Resist requests from the seller to improve your offer. Instead, ask the seller for a counteroffer. If you won't accept blank, what will you accept? Sometimes new buyers fall into this trap. They put an offer out, gets rejected. They're told to improve their offer. They do. That one gets rejected. And that process just kind of rinse and repeat forever, right? No, we won't keep improving our offer. If you won't accept our offer, what will you accept? Number 10, make all concessions reluctant concessions. Sellers want to prevail in hard negotiations. They want to brag down at the pub that they really worked the buyer over. So never easily or enthusiastically concede on seller requests. Even if you know in the end you're going to do it, make it difficult. Grumble a little bit. Begrudgingly concede if you have to and hopefully get something in return. There's actually a perceived benefit from the seller in doing that because they feel like they've got every possible thing they can get. That's the benefit of you engaging in hard negotiations. Number 11, avoid questioning the seller ask price. Instead, question the transfer of value. What I'm saying here is avoid broker or seller math, which is an exercise they will go through to justify their premium ask price. And so I don't say, listen, no, I don't agree with that ask price. I don't think it is reasonable. No, I say this is what the business is worth to us. And if there's a difference between what you want and what I'm willing to pay, it's not because, one of us is right or wrong about the value of the business. It's about transferring that value. And I just don't believe it can all be transferred to me as a buyer, right? Because of the goodwill that's personally associated with the seller of that business. Number 12, always validate the seller's perspective. Yes, I understand. Yes, I can see why you think that way. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, I would feel that way if I were you. So we're always validating the seller's perspective. The seller is not wrong about anything. We more take the tack that this is what we can do and here are the reasons why. We understand, right? We convey that. We don't necessarily agree. We have our own reasons for making our offers, but we're not opposing the seller and their perspective. Number 13, avoid renegotiating agreement with counsel. This is hugely important. You need to warn the seller up front that you won't revisit previously agreed to terms with opposing counsel during the drafting of the formal buy-sell agreement. Because you know what? It happens almost all of the time. At least to me, it does. So we need a strategy to avoid it. We spend all this time hammering out agreement with the seller. Then all of a sudden the seller's lawyer is drafting the buy-sell agreement and they want to renegotiate, half of the agreement. You need to tell the seller that you're not prepared to do that. Number 14, we can only effectively negotiate with final decision makers. So if a seller makes an appeal to a third party authority, insist that third party participate in the negotiations. That's the way to short circuit that approach that a seller might take. 15, tough negotiations can build strong bonds. Don't be afraid of them. If you're negotiating in good faith, showing respect, being fair and reasonable, and being tough, it really helps in getting the deal across the finish line because it helps you build trust with the seller. 16, does an offer sequence work? You hear about that sometimes. This is my first offer, my second offer, my third offer, my fourth offer. It can, but lots of flexibility is needed because we are reacting to counter offers made by the seller a lot of the time. Nothing wrong with an offer sequence, but it doesn't typically play out according to the way that we've planned it. Number 17, how do we deal with impasse? To me, you need to isolate the deal point that's behind the impasse and then move on from that deal point to other deal points. We want to rebuild momentum by getting agreement on other deal points before we come back to the impasse deal point. Or we can even break down that impasse deal point into subunits and try and get some agreement on those as a way to break through on impasse. So how do we deal with impasse? The most important thing is don't allow the seller to dig in. Don't allow a siege mentality to develop. Because if you have two dug-in parties on either side, tough to recover from. So we resolve impasse through agreement. We find something that we can agree on, try to rebuild momentum that way. Negotiations is no one right way to carry out buyer-seller negotiations. Personal approaches can be very different for sure, but you do need a negotiation plan or strategy. You need to be prepared because deals close when negotiations go smoothly. So you need to think about negotiations, talk about how you're going to handle certain approaches. Really important to being a successful deal maker. In our next video, we'll take a look at accepting the offer. Meanwhile, let's get after it. This is the Do-It-Yourself Guide to Business Buying. Today, we have been talking about negotiations because we like to learn and grow as we go. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.